If you could describe some of the events leading up to your decision to come to the University of Florida.
I'll try. Now, in preparation for this, I have made 2 pages of notes. Ordinarily, that would be enough to teach a whole course. So I'm trying to be brief and to the point, but I may ramble. And if I look out, it looks like you're nodding off. I'll get back to the topic. So, why did I come to the University of Florida? First of all, it's necessary for you to know my background and training. I was what we would now call a Hully. Died in the wool, 4th generation. Hull, Spence, Kimball, and me. And Kimball was Gregory Kimball was my mentor at Duke. While I was at Duke, a visiting professor from the University of Florida named Herb Kimmel came, and he set up a classical conditioning laboratory to study the GSR, the galvanic skin response. I was emphasizing the eyelid, but the eyelid lab was busy with a senior student, so I worked with Herb. I got assigned to Herb, and we became friends, and he was originally a faculty member at the University of Florida. So I think that association in some way greased the skids for me to get an invitation to come to the University of Florida, which came in 1962. And that's when I got my degree and got invited down here and had to miss the first appointment because I had the chicken pox. I was only 24 at the time and still had never quite outgrown the need for chicken pox. So anyhow, came down here, got the job, and was assigned to teach classical experimental psychology, learning and statistics at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. Now, one of the things that influenced me, even before I left Duke, was an accidental meeting with a gentleman named Ogden Lindsley. Anybody recognize that name? A few people do. I will say a little bit about Ogden. We met at a thing called the Psychonomic Society prior to the APA meeting in 1961. It was my first presentation at APA, and my mentor, Gregory Kimball, said, I want to introduce you to somebody. And he introduced me to Ogden. He said, beware, this is the reincarnation of Mephistopheles. And he was accurate. We formed a relationship not based on science or technology, but on the basis of music. And that kind of bonded us so that later on, when he visited the University of Florida, Department of Psychiatry, in pursuit of or to share his experiences in the operant conditioning of schizophrenics. He was the first person to do this on humans in the laboratory with community recorders. And I found that kind of impressive. So he came down here to talk to the psychiatry department. But having done that, he sort of gravitated toward me again and began to mentor me. Now understand, back in those days, if you were a Hullian, you did not speak to Skinnerians. You did not speak to Pennypackers. You stayed in your own lane. But Ogden took me aside and said, you know, there's a number of ways to get large N. One of them is to observe the same organism many, many times, rather than many organisms once. Well, that makes sense. So then we started to talk about the history of science and his history and so on. And that kind of stuck with me. Now, back to the University of Florida, here I am teaching these courses. But behavior modification as a kind of movement is beginning to develop. And I actually had a little seminar out at our house in the lake, bringing in people from other departments and areas to talk about this. And it's getting more and more exciting, more and more interesting. So finally, in 1964, I think it was, I persuaded our chairman that maybe we needed to broaden the field a little bit. I'd like to hire somebody in what was then called instrumental conditioning. we didn't speak publicly about operant conditioning, but instrumental conditioning was okay. So I got permission to go out and hire a person in that area. That person lasted a year, and then we had to go find another one. And in 1967, I think it was, I was successful in recruiting Ed Malagodi, who you should know, and pictures out in the hall. And Ed had died in the Wolskin area. And so he comes and we start the program, basically. Now, the first instance of 622 was when Ed and I and a few students that we sort of conned into joining us went through JAB from page 1, volume 1, all the way as far as we could get. We just read JAB. Remember, this is years before Java. And that really is the beginning of 622. We would meet once a week, and people would prepare articles and we discuss them and so forth. The sort of quote program emerged out of that series of experiences. One of the things was that it was clear to us that the prevailing philosophy, if we're going to have a program, should be a deliberate blurring of the basic and applied. We started out firmly believing that the principles of behavior apply across settings and across species. So Ed stayed in the lab running rats, and I went out in the world and messed things up. So we had a basic and applied program, so to speak. Well, that's the beginning of it.
Yeah, so you're on track. I was planning to ask about the development of the so-called 622. We still call this class 622, even though it hasn't been that for many, many years. But so that means that you've been attending this class for about 53 years, and you're still a regular attendee. So thank you for that.
Well, I got my basic training, as it were, in operant conditioning, behavior analysis, in that 622. Reading JAB cover to cover, and that's how it happened. I had not read JAB before. I had read Skinner, but I had read Sidman, but I didn't appreciate it. But anyway, that's the origin of this. My personal experience, as well as the development of the course.
Spectacular. Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk to you about is that you have written one of the most influential behavior analysis textbooks, along with Jim Johnston. Could you describe a little bit of the background leading to the development of that book and how the writing was done and over what period of time?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. The need for that, I perceived, was that the emerging field of whatever it was, behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, the intellectual discipline that emerged out of the Midwestern Association of Behavior Analysis meeting in 1974, I think. Might be right. No, that's not right. 64, 65, 66. Anyway, there emerged this growing body centered primarily at Western Michigan. But other little schools with directions in their name was having little pseudopods of this behavioral thing. And I looked at what was going on. Remember, I'm classically trained at Duke with a minor in mathematical statistics. And I thought, these people are Luddites. They're running around bitching about statistics, and they don't know anything about this. We need a book. We need some kind of source to educate these people. If we're going to live with them, we want them to be smart enough to talk to us, to be blunt about it. And so we undertook the book. The book took 4 years to write. We would meet every morning in one of our houses, handwrite the manuscript. Jim incidentally still has the handwritten version, which might actually bring a couple bucks at the auction. But during the course of that, we kind of divided it into two parts. I took the first part, which was the history and the philosophy of science as it applied to behavior. And then the second part, Jim did most of the applied work, the actual, if you will, tactics of research, design, interpretation, and that kind of thing. But we merged the two together. This is fortunate because my writing style in those days was somewhat more elaborate than Shakespeare at his worst. Jim, on the other hand, wrote exactly like you would write if you were writing owner's manuals for washing machines. There was just absolute sparsity of prose in his writing, and I overdid in mine. So we had to blend the two, which in the first edition really never was accomplished successfully. But some of the things I learned in the course of doing this, with the emphasis on the history of measurement, was that there really emerged around the beginning of the 18th century a distinctive form of measurement that led to the formation of the social sciences. And I found that fascinating. A Belgian astronomer named Adolphe Quetelet had grabbed onto the emerging emphasis of the normal curve from probability and statistics and the benefits of that to insurance and gambling and what have you. He would look at things like the chest circumferences of 10,000 Scottish soldiers. He basically went around measuring things like anthropomorphic things, and discovered that every time he did that, a normal curve appeared. Now, he didn't leave that alone. He used that to make inference about the cause. Why is this variability? Well, his reasoning was that it's a write that Quetelet, Quetelet, important name in the history of measurement. And his reasoning was that nature kept trying to make the perfect one and would miss. This grew out of the notion of the normal curve being the normal law of error. And so here we have nature making errors over and over. So we looked at that, and then we looked at the history of measurement in what I would now call the natural sciences. And they're very different. In the natural sciences, such as they were at the time, and still are, measurement was based on absolute units, independent of the phenomenon being measured. So Quetelet developed a system accidentally in which the units grew out of variability in the underlying phenomenon. Well, if you think about it, once you use the underlying phenomenon to make a measurement system, you've exhausted the possibility of using it to analyze the source of the variability in the first place, which is, of course, what science is supposed to be doing. But that so struck us, that dichotomy that was emerging, that we felt we had to give it a name. So we coined the term vagonotic. That's a hard G, remember? Vagonotic means wandering name, as opposed to eidemotic, meaning the same name. And that was a characteristic of the first book that I'm still very proud of. Nobody else uses it, never have. You don't see it printed anywhere. But people ask me at meetings, what happened to vagonotic? Oh, no. And that led me to the conclusion, which I still cherish, that this is a very different subject matter that flowed out of Quetelet and using variability to define the underlying phenomenon from the natural scientific approaches of chemistry, physics, and so on, where the units exist independently of the phenomenon being measured. So we then, I think we can take credit for this, coined the term natural science versus social science. And what we're studying is the natural science of behavior. Now, I don't want to lay public claim to that term. I think we have been used before. But clearly, it was a very, very different animal that was now being studied in the social sciences than what we were interested in. And we then made a big attempt to show that behavior of living organisms is, in fact, a natural scientific phenomenon. It does not require analysis of its variability in order to generate a unit, but rather you have units already there, like frequency and acceleration. This is the same as the natural scientific measures of physical phenomena and physical phenomena change. So rate, speed, whatever, and acceleration. I have to say that I think that, from my point of view, the major accomplishment of that book, it educated me to an extent that I had never anticipated when we sat down to write the thing. And those features have stuck with me all these years.
You also had
incidentally, it's now in its 4th edition.
you also had a very distinct style of undergraduate teaching, and every year at conferences and so on, we see so many people who were influenced by your teaching during their undergraduate years. Could you describe to this group how your undergraduate system worked?
I can try. This all started in the fall of 1967. I was grading a set of finals from the learning course, and I thought to myself, we ought to be able to do better than this. We've now seen chimps flying spacecraft. Why is it that we cannot get undergraduates to uniformly emit verbal behavior at an expert level about the subject matter? Well, because we don't know how to do that. So I called Jim Johnston, said, here's an idea. You want to join me in this effort? Let's start with a blank sheet of paper and take what we know about behavior and how to change it, which by then, had grown in a pretty good body of literature, and see if we can apply this to college teaching. So this is what we did. We first decided that the target, the behavior that we're going to try to change, is the verbal behavior of students about the subject matter, which is behavior analysis, or whatever the subject matter. We will then take samples of that behavior and establish criteria that we can use as goals or aims for the teaching technology, whatever that turns out to be. And lacking no other resource, we took the graduate students and exposed them to a series of questions that gave us a frequency and an accuracy measure of what we call expert behavior. We didn't have any real experts, but we had the graduate students. So, based on that, we then go back and say, okay, how do we go build this behavior? And just using very simple behavioral principles, we start out by getting them to emit the verbal behavior. They got to hear themselves talk like experts in the field. Not just read it, but say it. So when you, I used to say, when you encounter an expert in some field, how do you know it's an expert? Well, their subject matter is accurate, as far as you know, but they do it at a frequency that we now call fluency. So if you're humming and hawing and maybe I don't know, that's not fluent. So we set frequency criteria for them just reading what we call fill in the blank questions. So there's a whole lot of words there with one missing, and they supply the missing word. So as they're doing that, they're building a vocabulary that's based on what they're hearing and saying to themselves, and it's public. We move from that, we drop the stimulus control a bit to where they're now doing short answer essay questions. So you can see that as we go from fill in the blank ones to the short answer ones, they have to supply more of the behavior on their own. There's still cues there, but we're fading out all that. And then finally, at the end, they emit verbal behavior in the presence of an acknowledged expert, maybe me or Jim or one of the graduate students, to convince us, as we used to say, if you sat down next to Fred Skinner in a bar, could you convince him that you know what you're talking about? Here's how you would do that. Now, how do we, then the technology for doing this involves something I observed in graduate school, which I learned more in the coffee room from my peers than I ever learned from the professors or the textbooks. How do we put that to use? Well, we did what Fred Keller did too in the Pennypacker, and that is identify what he called proctors, what we call managers, who in fact work with the students individually on their terms and their times and their schedules to build this behavior. And once it was built to the satisfactory frequencies, they would come and do orals with one of us. Now, the people who got the most out of this process were not the students, but the managers, because they would go through it over and over again. And as Tim points out, it's those people who went on to populate the field to some considerable extent. People like Gerald Pilgrim and others went through as managers. Probably my favorite example of this comes much, much later, but it's Claire St. Peter. Tim's student, but I rescued her, rescued her from personality. She was going into counseling when she took the course. Now, that technology came to the attention of the university. I would just assume they hadn't done this, but at that time, the university had a problem. The so-called University College, which was the first 2 years, was everybody had to take courses at University College. And part of the population of University College was high-risk entering students, who up to that time had been just a revolving door. They'd come in, 80% of them come in, and 20% of them would stay. That was one population. The other population was the athletes. They had to be kept eligible. So we were approached by the university to expand this technology to meet these needs. I won't go into detail on that, but it worked. So we turned the failure rate from 80% down to 20% on the high-risk students. And in the years it was working, we never lost a student an athlete eligibility. And we used basically the same techniques. Individualized instruction. The other important thing is we did not do the testing. The courses that participated prepared the tests and all that. We had no access to that. We just were told what the subject matter was and taught them how to emit verbal behavior that was appropriate. And they did, and it worked. That technology is alive and well today in other places. It didn't survive here because of some conflicts that we generated deliberately. You kind of see through where it is going. Somehow you have to find a way to compensate the managers. And you can only give so many hours of independent credit. So we proposed that instead of that, maybe it would be a good idea to give tuition credits based on the performance of the manager's students. So in other words, if you have 5 students, all of whom get A's in the course, then you might get 5 hours of free tuition. And that did not fly. Why? If you stop and think about it, and we stopped and thought about it, knew this was going to happen. To pay people for effective teaching is just not done, particularly at the university level. So there you go. What else do you want to say about that?
Let's switch to graduate teaching for a moment. If you could describe some memorable moments or seminars associated with your career in teaching graduate students.
If I could, that would be wonderful. I had thought about that. And with the exception of the presentations at 622 of our students, particularly those that were involved in the breast cancer research, I can't think of any. I'm sure there were some, but it became, well, one of the things that both Ed and I stressed in the 622 development was we're going to teach these people to make presentations at a professional level, and not just get up and stammer and hum and haw like I'm doing now, looking at notes, but to make absolute effective professional presentations, which are extremely useful in preparation for job talks. And so we would emphasize each, as it does now, I mean, there's not much change. We would emphasize the importance of content and fluency of presentation in the students' individual areas of research, which of course the faculty supported. Mark's here to correct me on any of this, but I think that's pretty much what we're trying to do.
We thought we were doing it.
Yeah.
It seemed like they were getting better the longer they were here.
In some cases, they actually got jobs.
Great.
So I thought, I thought hard. That's all I have to say. Really.
Okay. I do remember another method that you used when I was a graduate student, which was the idea book.
Oh, yeah.
And that one stuck with me for quite a while and was helpful in my career. Could you recall a few?
Well,
thoughts about
yeah.
that?
I can't remember any of my ideas, but that's okay. Yeah, I thought one of the things that actually I learned as an undergraduate was you should carry a notebook, and when you get a good idea, write it down. And Skinner did the same thing. Now, he would so systematically organize this. There would be a page, and then tear out that page, and then later on, when you do anything else, he would add ideas that were stimulated by that idea. So you go around, you collect observations, you collect your own ideas, sort them, and pretty soon you've got a paragraph or an article. And it's very easy. As many of Skinner's techniques were, it's very easy with just slowly shaping, not one whole big effort at once, but just little bits, little steps, little feet. And so I practiced that and encouraged other people, students especially. So when in the graduate courses we taught, one of the requirements was an idea book, because I wanted, sometimes you have to force things in order to get them started. But as Tim reminds me, one of the things we turned in at the end of every graduate seminar was their idea book, which I would go through carefully and comment on, which then would presumably either throw it away or they would say, oh yeah, okay, let's carry that on. I cannot point to any cases in which one of those ideas ever amounted. But maybe they did.
I think they did. Not mine, but I'd also like you to touch on some of your work in breast self-examination, both in terms of some of the original research and then subsequent translation to practice.
Yeah, that to me is a very interesting case study. We were so infused and enthused about our own ability to identify and solve problems. We became obnoxious to live with. As many of you from that era might have heard, behavior analysts in those days were really lousy colleagues. But all of that is to say that one of the things we did was look for problems, look for areas that were ripe for intervention, ripe for understanding, ripe for study. And my soon to have become lifelong colleague, Mark Goldstein, attended a meeting in San Antonio called Breast Cancer, the Behavioral Dimension. Now, Mark was working at the VA, trained as a clinical psychologist. Incidentally, Ogden Lindsay's brother-in-law, which I got to get him quickly. But Mark went to this meeting, and it was pointed out that women were bringing in lumps the size of golf balls. And mammography had been around for several years, but wasn't any good if you didn't find smaller lumps, earlier forms of the cancer for mammography to evaluate. So the conclusion of the conference that he went to was that we just have to deal with the anxiety and the problems and so forth associated with it. So he came back and told us that at this meeting, and we were having at that time a dinner and party for Charlie Catania, who was giving a talk. And Mark Burson tells us this. And Charlie, well, hell, that's the problem in stimulus control. What is? Well, you've got to bring this behavior of detecting lumps under the control of the appropriate stimuli. And that set us to thinking, and the next day we said, yeah, that's a good idea. And we launched this program of self-examination of breasts in an effort to find cancer. And I gave two talks on this last year, so we won't go into the details of that. But the point of what we want to say now is what emerged was a multidisciplinary program. We involved medicine, material sciences, psychology, behavior analysis. We put together a program in which we did basic research to answer some fundamental questions like, well, how small a lump can fingers actually feel? Let's assume we're using fingers. We were shocked when we started this to discover there had been no experimental analysis of this at all. What research there was from social psychology, which attempted to explain the problem in terms of attitudes. We don't do this because they're afraid of what they'll find, et cetera, et cetera. Truth is, they didn't do well with it because they didn't know how. So, we did, as I say, a very careful experimental analysis using research from psychophysics, using material sciences to develop a model that would provide a base for developing training, and then took off from there. And we learned some wonderful things. We learned, for example, that these fingers, even untrained, can find breast lumps as small as 3 millimeters in diameter. Now, that was at the time when the average size brought in by accident or by some kind of discovery was around 2 centimeters. So we're talking orders of magnitude smaller. And moreover, that this could be trained on a fairly reliable basis, and the benefits we later showed in some studies were real. You could find real breast cancers at very early stages by applying this technique. What I take from this now, I mean, the company that we formed is still in operation. We're now focusing on training of clinicians to do competent clinical exam. I still do the self-exam stuff, but right now, for example, we have a contract to train all of the public health nurses in the state of Georgia to do competent clinical breast exam. Because we bring to this our usual emphasis on measurement and standards, which is kind of unique in this field. And for that reason, we have survived as a company and as a technology with practically no support and a lot of competition from things like mammography and all of the ographies that come along and make people rich, but may not be so effective as we would hope. One of the things I take away from that for all of us is the opportunity that is provided behavior analysis if it will expand its view, incorporate and involve other specialties, and attack big problems. And this is what that did and still does. And I think there's a lot of other fields like this or problems like this. And you know, like sustainability is an example. Like you're going to have to involve other people besides behavior analysts. Climate control. You can slice out pieces of that problem that we can uniquely contribute to. But we have to be willing to do this, as we were, in coordination with other disciplines. And we may even be required, in some cases, to subordinate ourselves to other disciplines. I'm thinking here of neuropsychology. For example, we can bring to the problems of neuropsychology 2 or 3 unique things. Number one, we can define behavior. And number 2, we can measure behavior. They don't do that. If you read their literature, there's very little. At our level of sophistication, you have either definition or measurement of behavior. And the third thing we do, very very well is train it so that you can build a laboratory model, almost like an avatar of a particular behavioral phenomenon that you want to then study and look at the neurological components and so forth. So all of that's to say that cooperation, teamwork, and the ability to conceive of bigger problems and bigger domains than is typically done now in graduate programs, I think offers tremendous opportunity for our field in general. Probably enough on that subject.
Well, I'd like to point out that Hank really didn't look at his 2 pages of notes throughout the entire discussion. So maybe writing them helped him, but he didn't refer to them much. We have a few minutes left. If anyone has any questions, and if you present a question, I'll probably repeat it just to make sure the microphone picks it up. Does anyone have any questions?
Hey, Hank, so I have a strong recollection that for many years you would go around conferences putting stars on posters. Could you tell the students what that was about?
Yeah, it was about one of the most futile things I've ever done. We got so involved with the idea of direct measurement and using frequency. It's real use. But I thought, well, now, why don't we attempt to, quote, reinforce examples of that we see in the conferences? So we would go around with a little thing of gold stars and put a star on the poster. And people would say, what the hell are you doing? Why did you do that? And we would point out why. So I kept data on this for several years. You know, all the poster sessions at AVA, we would go to all of them. An exhausting experience. Did it have any effect? No. You would get about between 45 and 52% of the posters would have used real measurement. And the rest of them with something else, intervals of percent correct or something. I mean, it's funny, the hell with it. We're not going to change behavior very fast. I don't think we extinguished much. And people, as Willie just did, will come up years later and say, what happened to that thing? You put a star on my poster. Well, I think probably it was for this reason. Anyway, that was the idea. We thought if we can differentially reinforce aspects of what we want, we will get more of it. Obviously, we did not reinforce it. We just stimulated questions.
Well, actually, one of the things that was most striking when I first got here is I learned that within a week you could tell if somebody was working with Hank because that person was wearing a wrist counter. How did that ever develop? And it did actually eventually kind of fade away, but you had people counting everything.
That was the idea. If you're going to study behavior, the first thing you do is define it, and then the second thing you do is count instances. And if you're going to do this conveniently, you have to carry the counter with you. Now, I still count steps, but I use a pedometer to do it. And I have 14 years of continuous step recording until this accident. I missed a tremendous opportunity to chart the steps as an index of recovery. And as soon as I get back to where I can get the pedometer on, and so I will start doing that, because it should show a nice acceleration. One of the things that I have noticed is that by counting steps year after year after year, and this is really tedious and boring, but I can see aging. I can see in the overall frequencies, daily frequencies and monthly frequencies, weekly frequencies, slight decline over the years. So there's access to or ingress to geriatrics. The decline in function, which this of course is evident, that you can document with some precision if you just care enough to count. So that's it.
Who invented that phrase?
What, care enough to count?
Care enough to count. Do you get credit for that?
No, I care enough to chart was one of Ogden's things, which I wrote songs about. But Care enough to count, I guess we start a new trend. But one of the things on that whole general subject has lately come to my attention, which I thought, damn, why didn't I think of that? Is that if you record behavior in terms of its frequency, and you've got a number there, count per unit time, and you record the change in behavior in terms of acceleration and deceleration, you now have two direct measures of the phenomenon itself and the phenomenon undergoing change. And I've always thought that one of the objectives of the applied field is to engineer change. And one of the nice things about using the real measures, the direct measures of behavior, is that now you have two indices of the important phenomenon, the frequency itself and the change, so that when you're trying to describe behavior change, it's nice to have a number rather than a statement like, well, it seems to be going up. Or, I think it's getting better, and here's the data, here's the chart, or here's the, no, this is a step ahead where you actually put a number to it. And so that I'm hoping that I will live to see more and more application of our science at that level, because it has the potential to be a real contribution to the world in general. We can now measure behavior and measure its change precisely. And that has real work, I think.
I can't think of a more profound way to end our discussion. I'd like everybody to join me in thanking Hank for joining us today, sharing his perspective. And thanks to his family members for coming and other guests, Mark and others.
Can I take a second? My daughter Leslie and my grandson Ben, who are the handlers for this. Leslie is a physician at Shands. 4 years of experience. Her emphasis is on palliative care, and you can see the immediate application. And our grandson Ben is a product of the course we were talking about earlier on. He went through the experience and he survived. So thank you again.
Thank you. I hope you're able to. Yeah.
Send your letter. Thank you. Appreciate it. That doesn't work out.